The desert held its breath before dawn. Cochise crouched at the mesa's edge, weathered hands steady against red sandstone as he watched the valley below. The Chiricahua camp stirred quietly, smoke threading upward, children's voices carried like distant bird calls. 23 winters had passed since his father gave him the name meaning strength of mountains, and he had never failed to feel the weight of watching over his people. A scar along his temple caught first light, reminder of choosing to become scout rather than warrior, deciding that knowing movements of both Apache and white men might save more lives than taking them. A dust plume caught his attention, far southeast where desert met sky. Too small for cavalry, too steady for wind. A single rider, moving with the persistence of someone traveling for days. The stranger reached the narrow passage by midday. Cochise was waiting when the man's horse nickered at pulled reins. Younger than expected, perhaps 30 winters, with sun-darkened skin and hard-used clothes. "I'm looking for Cochise of the Chiricahua band," the stranger said, voice carrying a southern accent. "Who seeks him?" Cochise stepped from concealment, rifle low but ready. Gray eyes studied him with intelligent weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Name's Thomas Sullivan. I've been riding 8 days to find you." He shifted carefully, favoring his left arm, wounded, trying to hide it. "Why?" Sullivan was quiet, gaze moving across canyon walls as if memorizing them. When he looked back, something raw showed. "Because I have nowhere else to go." The honesty settled between them like stones in still water. No plea, no demand, just fact, delivered with quiet dignity of someone who'd accepted whatever answer he might receive. "Dismount. Walk slowly, hands visible." Sullivan complied with careful grace. Up close, the signs were clearer. Slight favor of left side, healing cut along jaw, clothes hanging loose as if he'd lost weight recently. "What do you run from, Thomas Sullivan?" Shadow passed across his features. "The man I used to be." The camp lay spread across a natural hollow, protected by high stone walls and accessible through 3 narrow passages. As Cochise led Sullivan along the eastern trail, children scattered like quail, running to alert adults. By the time they reached the central fire circle, a dozen warriors had emerged, faces showing varying degrees of suspicion and interest. Among them stood Ithaca, Cochise's sister, near the cooking area with her 5-year-old son pressed against her skirt. "This is Thomas Sullivan," Cochise announced in Apache. "He seeks shelter among us." Old Manuelito stepped forward, lined face revealing nothing. "Why should we give shelter to a white man?" The question came in English for Sullivan's benefit. Sullivan removed his hat, revealing brown hair streaked with premature gray. A moment of silence as he chose words carefully. "Because I have nothing to offer except my respect, and nowhere to go, except back to a life that no longer fits me." He paused, meeting Manuelito's eyes directly. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm asking anyway." The simplicity seemed to surprise several warriors. Cochise watched expressions around the circle: curiosity, suspicion, and something that might have been recognition. That evening, Sullivan sat slightly apart from the main group around the fire. He'd been given water and food, but the understanding was his status remained undetermined. Ithaca's son, Naelnish, had been watching the stranger with bold curiosity. Finally, he approached with the direct manner only children possess. "Why do you wear heavy clothes in the desert?" he asked in careful English. Sullivan smiled, the first genuine warmth Cochise had seen from him. "Because I didn't know better when I started this journey. I'm learning." The boy nodded solemnly. "Uncle Cochise says learning keeps you alive." "Your uncle sounds wise." "He's the best scout in all the mountains. He can track anything, knows where water hides in rocks. That must be useful knowledge. He could teach you, maybe, if you stayed long enough." Before Sullivan could respond, Ithaca appeared beside her son, hand gentle but firm on his shoulder. Nalnish, come help prepare tomorrow's meal." The boy obeyed without argument, but not before giving Sullivan a smile that encompassed all the innocent hope of childhood. Later that night, Cochise found Sullivan sitting at the firelight's edge, staring toward the desert. "You cannot sleep." Sullivan looked up, unsurprised. "Old habits. I've been traveling alone for a long time." Cochise settled on a nearby rock. The fire had burned to coals, casting warm glow barely reaching beyond their immediate circle. "How long?" "Since spring. Maybe longer, depending how you count it." Sullivan's voice carried weight of considerable distance. "I had a ranch outside Tucson. Cattle, horses, enough land for a good life." "Had?" Sullivan was quiet so long Cochise thought he might not answer. When words finally came, they emerged slowly. "Drought last year. Lost most of the herd. Then my partner, man I'd trusted for 5 years, sold off what was left and disappeared with everything." He picked up a small stone. "Bank took the land. I had enough left to buy this horse and supplies to get away." "Where did you think to go?" "Didn't much matter at first, just away." Sullivan tossed the stone into coals where it hissed. "But after a few weeks riding, I started hearing stories about Apache scouts who worked with the army, but also about bands who chose their own path. Heard your name mentioned more than once." "What did these stories say?" "That you were a man who understood both worlds, Apache and white, but chose to remain true to your people. That you'd found a way to survive without losing who you were." Sullivan met his eyes directly. "That sounded like something worth learning about." The next morning, Cochise approached as Sullivan attempted to fold his blanket properly. "You will come with me today." Not quite a question, but Sullivan treated it as one. "Where?" "To check water sources in the eastern canyons. If you stay among us, you must learn the country." The assumption implicit in those words, "if you stay," hung between them like a bridge being built piece by piece. They rode in comfortable silence the first hour, following game trails winding through spectacular rock formations. When they reached the first water source, a spring hidden between massive boulders, Cochise dismounted. "Water is life in this country. Without knowing where to find it, a man dies." Sullivan approached the spring with appropriate reverence, understanding he was being shown something valuable. Water emerged from a crack in the rock face, forming a small pool before disappearing underground. "How many places like this do you know?" "In this range? Perhaps 30 that flow year-round. Twice that many that hold water during the rainy season." Cochise knelt beside the pool, drinking slowly. "My father knew twice as many as I do. His father knew twice as many as that." The weight of generations lost settled over them both. Sullivan understood he was being offered not just survival knowledge, but a piece of cultural inheritance passed down through countless years. They visited 3 more water sources that morning, each hidden in ways requiring specific knowledge to find. At the 4th spring, they encountered fresh horse tracks in the mud. 2 horses, unshod, passed through yesterday evening. Cochise studied them carefully. Apache horses, but not from our band. After an hour of tracking, they found 2 Apache warriors sitting beside a dying fire in a small valley. Their horses grazed nearby, posture suggesting exhaustion rather than vigilance. Cochise called out in Apache, and the men looked up with relief. A rapid conversation followed, punctuated by gestures toward the south. "They are Mescalero," Cochise explained to Sullivan afterward. "They bring word that cavalry patrols have been pushing deeper into Apache territory, forcing many families to abandon traditional camps." Sullivan felt his stomach tighten. "Are they coming this way?" "Not immediately, but the pressure is increasing." When they returned to camp with the Mescalero warriors, Sullivan witnessed a process with ancient roots. The visitors were welcomed with formal courtesy, given food and water, invited to share their news with the assembled band. The discussion continued long into the evening. What emerged was a picture of increasing pressure from multiple directions: military patrols from the north, Mexican troops from the south, settlers pushing into traditional hunting grounds from the east. During a quiet moment, Ithaca approached Sullivan as he contemplated the dying fire. "You look troubled," she said in careful English. "I was thinking about what it means to belong somewhere, and what happens when that somewhere is threatened." She settled on a nearby rock, movements graceful despite the weariness he could see in her shoulders. "My husband used to say, home isn't a place. It's the people who accept you as you are." Her voice carried a note of old sadness. "But sometimes, even the people have to move." The next morning brought news that would change everything. A young Apache scout arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. His message was urgent. A large cavalry patrol had been spotted moving north from Fort Bowie, accompanied by Apache scouts from reservation bands. The camp responded with practiced efficiency. Within an hour, the most valuable possessions had been packed and the decision made to move deeper into the mountains, to a more defensible position. Sullivan found himself automatically helping with preparations, hands working alongside Apache hands to secure supplies and assist with the elderly and children. No one questioned his participation. Ithaca appeared beside him as he helped load a pack horse. "You could leave now," she said quietly. "Ride south and avoid whatever is coming." Sullivan paused, considering her words. The thought had occurred to him. He had enough supplies to reach Mexico. "I could," he agreed, "but I won't." "Why?" He looked around at the controlled urgency of the camp's preparations, at Cochise directing the scouts, at Nalnish helping his mother without being asked. "Because this is the first place in a long time that has felt like it might become home." She studied his face with careful assessment. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded once and returned to her preparations. The retreat began at midday, moving in small groups along paths that seemed to exist more in memory than in any visible marking of the landscape. The new camp occupied a natural amphitheater high in the mountains, surrounded by sheer walls approachable only through a single narrow defile. It was a place chosen for defense rather than comfort. The band's mood had shifted with the move. Children played more quietly, and adults carried weapons more openly. Sentries were posted, and Cochise spent long hours studying the approaches through battered field glasses. Sullivan made himself useful where he could, drawing on his ranching experience with the horses and basic medical knowledge to assist with minor injuries. He was tending a cut on a young warrior's hand when Cochise approached with a proposition. "I need someone to ride to Tucson," Cochise said without preamble, "to learn what the military is planning, how many troops are involved, whether this is a general campaign or response to specific incidents." Sullivan looked up from his work, understanding immediately. "Intelligence gathering. You could move freely in the town, ask questions, listen to conversations in saloons and supply stores." Cochise's expression was carefully neutral. "It would be dangerous. If you were caught with information about Apache movements, you would likely be shot as a spy." The wounded warrior had been listening with interest, and Sullivan noticed several other band members moving closer, attention focused on his response. "When would I need to leave?" "Tonight. The cavalry patrol will reach our old camp tomorrow, and when they find it abandoned, they will spread out to search the surrounding area." Sullivan finished bandaging the warrior's hand, mind working through the implications. It would mean choosing sides in a conflict where the lines were becoming increasingly clear and unforgiving. That evening, as Sullivan prepared for the journey, Nalnish approached with the shy determination children use when they have something important to say. "Are you coming back?" the boy asked, young face serious in the firelight. Sullivan knelt to bring himself to the child's eye level. "I plan to, yes, but sometimes plans change. My father said he would come back from the fight near Fort Bowie." Nalnish's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sullivan could see carefully controlled emotion beneath. "He didn't." The simple honesty hit Sullivan with unexpected force. "I can't promise nothing will happen to me on this journey," he said carefully. "But I can promise that if it's possible for me to return, I will." Nalnish considered this, then nodded with the gravity of someone much older. Before Sullivan could respond, the boy reached into his shirt and pulled out a small carved figure, a horse carved from pale wood, its lines simple but unmistakably alive. "My father made this for me. Will you carry it?" Nalnish held out the carving. "So you won't forget to come back." Sullivan accepted the small horse with the reverence it deserved, understanding he was being entrusted with something irreplaceable. "I'll guard it with my life," he said, and meant it. 3 days later, Sullivan entered Tucson dusty and travel-worn enough to blend with the steady stream of drifters moving through territorial towns. He spent the afternoon in careful reconnaissance, nursing a beer in different saloons while listening to conversations and observing military personnel. What he learned troubled him more than expected. The current patrol was just the beginning of a coordinated campaign designed to force all Apache bands onto designated reservations. Additional troops were en route from California, and local commanders had been given broad authority to use whatever methods they deemed necessary. More disturbing were rumors about bounties being offered for Apache scalps, and the formation of civilian militias authorized to pursue hostile bands wherever they might be found. That night, Sullivan made his way to the adobe church on the town's edge where Father Miguel held evening services. The priest was a man of about 50, with intelligent eyes and a weathered face. Sullivan waited until the service ended before approaching the priest outside the church. "Father Miguel, I wonder if I might speak with you." The priest studied him in the lamplight. "You are the rancher Sullivan. I heard you had lost your land. Word travels fast in small towns. Faster when the army is asking questions about a man." Father Miguel gestured toward a bench. "Sit. Tell me what troubles you." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the town settling into evening. "Father, what do you know about the Apache bands in the mountains?" "I know they are people trying to live according to their own understanding of how life should be lived. I know they are under tremendous pressure to abandon that understanding." The priest's voice carried no judgment. "I also know many good people will die before this situation resolves itself." Sullivan chose his next words carefully. If a man found himself caught between different loyalties, to his own people and to others who had shown him kindness, how would you counsel him? Father Miguel was quiet for a long time, eyes fixed on the desert horizon. "I would tell him that God judges us not by the color of our skin or the language we speak, but by how we treat those who have no power to help themselves. Sometimes choosing the right path means choosing the difficult path." The priest turned to look at Sullivan directly. "And a man's true loyalty should be to justice and mercy, not to the accidents of his birth." The simple profundity of the answer settled over Sullivan like a benediction. He found himself thinking about Nalnish's carved horse, about Ithaca's quiet strength, about Cochise's careful balance between protecting his people and maintaining his integrity. "Thank you, Father. Go carefully, my son. There are difficult times ahead for all of us." Sullivan left Tucson before dawn, carrying information that would change the calculations of everyone in Cochise's band. The military campaign was larger and more systematic than they had imagined. He pushed hard the first day, wanting distance between himself and any pursuit. On the second day, he encountered the first sign the military net was tightening: cavalry patrol tracks in the sandy soil, less than a day old. Sullivan left the main trail and began following game paths through more difficult terrain, sacrificing speed for concealment. The information he carried was too important to risk losing to a chance encounter. Late afternoon on the third day, he finally reached the hidden valley. The sentries challenged him from concealment, and he was relieved to hear familiar voices. The camp had changed in his absence: more weapons visible, more defensive preparations, an atmosphere of controlled tension. Cochise met him at the camp's edge, expression serious but relieved. "You have news." "Yes, and none of it good." As they walked toward the central fire, Sullivan reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the small carved horse Nalnish had entrusted to him. "First, though, I believe this belongs to someone here." Nalnish appeared as if summoned by magic, young face bright with relief and joy. He accepted the carved horse with careful reverence, then looked up at Sullivan with profound gratitude. "You came back." "I promised I would," Sullivan replied, understanding something important had been completed with that simple exchange. The council that followed was unlike any Sullivan had ever witnessed. The news he brought about the military operation's size, civilian militia involvement, and bounties being offered for Apache scalps transformed the nature of the choices facing the band. Old Manuelito spoke first, outlining 3 options: immediate flight to Mexico, surrender to the reservation system, or preparation for armed resistance. Each choice carried terrible costs. Flight would mean abandoning ancestral lands. Surrender would mean the end of traditional life and dependence on inadequate government rations. Resistance would mean war against overwhelming odds. The discussion continued late into the night, with each adult band member given opportunity to speak. Sullivan listened with growing understanding of the impossible situation these people faced. Every choice led to loss. When his turn came to speak, he found himself thinking about Father Miguel's words about loyalty to justice rather than accidents of birth. "I'm not Apache," he said quietly, "so I have no right to vote on what this band should do. But I can tell you what I've learned about myself during these past weeks." The circle was silent, waiting. "I learned that home isn't about where you come from. It's about where you choose to belong. I learned that some things are worth more than safety, and that sometimes the only way to keep your honor is to risk everything else." He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of people who had become more than strangers. "Whatever you decide, I want to stand with you." Ithaca was the first to respond. "You would stay, even if it means war?" "I would stay, even if it means dying, because this is where I belong now." The simple declaration seemed to resonate through the group like ripples spreading across still water. Sullivan saw Cochise nod slightly, and old Manuelito's expression soften with something that might have been approval. When the formal discussion resumed, something had changed. The presence of a white man willing to share their fate had somehow altered the calculation of what was possible. The decision, when it came, reflected the pragmatic wisdom that had kept the Apache people alive through centuries of change. They would not surrender to the reservation, but neither would they engage in direct military confrontation with overwhelming force. Instead, they would become ghosts in their own land, maintaining their traditional life through mobility, concealment, and intimate knowledge of country that gave them advantages no army could match. The strategy required splitting into smaller groups that could move quickly and leave minimal traces. Family units would scatter across a network of hidden camps, coming together only when necessary. It was a form of resistance that preserved what mattered most while avoiding direct confrontation that would invite annihilation. Sullivan found himself assigned to Cochise's group, which would include Ithaca and her son along with 3 other families. Their territory would be the eastern canyons, where he had first learned to read the signs of hidden water. As the band prepared to disperse, Sullivan experienced the strange sensation of watching a community deliberately fragment itself in order to survive. Families that had lived side by side for years embraced with the careful restraint of people who understood they might not see each other again for a very long time. Old Manuelito approached Sullivan as he checked his horse's gear. "You have chosen a hard path, Thomas Sullivan." "It seems to me I've chosen the only path that makes sense." The elder nodded slowly. "My grandfather told me once that a man's character is revealed not by what he does when he has many choices, but by what he does when he has only one choice that allows him to remain who he truly is." Winter came early that year, bringing snow to the higher elevations and bitter cold that made survival a matter of daily vigilance. The small group had prepared well, but the season tested every aspect of their adaptation to this new way of life. One particularly cold night, as wind howled through the canyons, Ithaca sat beside the carefully banked fire working on a pair of moccasins for her son. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, each stitch placed with precision. Sullivan watched her work with the fascination he had developed for all displays of traditional knowledge. "May I ask you something?" he said quietly. She looked up from her work, dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Of course. Do you ever think about what your life might have been like if the world had been different? If there had been no soldiers, no pressure to abandon traditional ways?" Her hand stilled on the moccasin, and for a moment she seemed to be looking at something far beyond their shelter walls. "I think about my husband sometimes, and what he would have wanted for Nalnish. I think about the stories my grandmother told me about the time when our people could follow the seasons without fear." She resumed her stitching, but her voice carried something deeper than simple nostalgia. "But I have learned that spending too much time thinking about what might have been can keep you from seeing what is possible now. My son is healthy and strong. We have good people around us who share both the burdens and the joys of this life." She looked at Sullivan directly, expression serious but not without warmth. "And sometimes, if we are very fortunate, we discover that the family we choose can be as strong as the family we are born into." Spring brought both relief and increased danger. Warmer weather meant easier living, but also the resumption of military patrols. Cochise began receiving reports from scouts maintaining contact between scattered Apache groups, and the news was consistently troubling. Several bands had been forced to surrender after running out of food and ammunition during winter. Others had been tracked down by mixed patrols, leading to skirmishes that left families scattered and leaders dead or captured. The pressure was building toward some kind of resolution, and everyone understood their current way of life could not continue indefinitely. The answer came in late spring, when Cochise returned from a secret meeting with leaders from other surviving bands. His expression as he gathered the group around the evening fire told Sullivan that significant decisions had been made. "The time has come to choose a final path," Cochise announced without preamble. "The military commanders have made it clear there will be no negotiated settlement that allows us to maintain traditional life in this territory. We can surrender to the reservation, fight until we are all dead, or seek sanctuary in Mexico." The silence that followed was heavy with implications everyone understood. Each choice represented the end of something that had sustained these people for countless generations. "The other leaders have agreed to attempt a coordinated movement south," Cochise continued. "Small groups will leave at different times, following different routes, with the goal of reuniting in the Sierra Madre Mountains." Sullivan felt his chest tighten as he realized what this meant. After all the adaptation, all the learning, all the gradual development of belonging, they would be leaving the country that had become home. Nalnish, who had been listening with serious attention, raised his hand in the formal manner Cochise had taught him. "Uncle Cochise, what about the places where grandfather's spirit lives? If we leave, who will remember the stories about those places?" The question hung in the air like smoke from their fire. touching on something that went deeper than mere practical considerations. Cochise knelt down to bring himself to the boy's eye level, expression gentle but serious. "The stories live in us, Nalnish. As long as we remember them and tell them to our children, the spirits of those places travel with us wherever we go." It was, Sullivan realized, both true and heartbreaking, a way of understanding cultural survival that acknowledged terrible loss while maintaining hope for continuity. The final 2 weeks passed with the strange intensity that comes from knowing every familiar moment is also a farewell. Sullivan found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before. The particular way morning light fell across the canyon walls, the sound of water moving over stone in the hidden spring. On their last evening in the canyon, as the group made final preparations for departure, Ithaca approached him with something wrapped in soft leather. "I have made this for you," she said, offering the bundle with formality that suggested its significance. Sullivan unwrapped the leather to reveal a pair of moccasins crafted with meticulous care. The leather was soft and supple, decorated with subtle beadwork incorporating traditional Apache patterns. "They are beautiful," he said, understanding the gift represented far more than practical footwear. "They are for walking new paths," she replied, "for a man who has learned that home is not a place, but a way of being in the world with honor." That night, the group gathered around their fire for the last time, sharing stories and songs that would help them remember this place and this time in their lives. Sullivan listened to voices that had become as familiar as his own breathing. When old Manuelito called him forward to participate in a simple ceremony of farewell, Sullivan felt the weight of acceptance and belonging that had been building slowly over all these months. "Thomas Sullivan," the elder said in his formal voice, "you came to us as a stranger seeking shelter. You remain with us as family, sharing whatever fate awaits us all." The words were simple, but they carried the force of recognition that went beyond mere sentiment. Sullivan had become, in some essential way that transcended the circumstances of his birth, one of them. They left before dawn, as the eastern sky showed the first pale suggestion of approaching light. The group moved in single file along trails that seemed to exist more in memory than in any visible marking of the landscape. Sullivan rode near the middle of the small column, his bay mare stepping carefully through terrain that had become as familiar as the patterns of his own heartbeat. Walking beside his horse was Nalnish, chattering quietly about the animals they might encounter on their journey south, and riding ahead was Cochise, whose acceptance had made this new life possible. As they climbed out of the canyon that had sheltered them through winter and into spring, Sullivan turned for one last look at the red stone walls that had become home. The morning light was beginning to paint them in shades of gold and rose, creating a beauty so intense it seemed to burn itself into memory. Then he turned south toward Mexico and an uncertain future, carrying with him the knowledge that home was indeed something you chose, something you built through daily acts of loyalty and care, something that could survive any loss except the loss of the people who made it real. The desert stretched ahead of them like an ocean of possibility, harsh and unforgiving, but also vast enough to contain whatever dreams they could sustain. And somewhere in that vastness, beyond the reach of armies and the demands of a world that seemed determined to destroy anything it could not control, lay the promise of a place where they could continue to be who they had always been. Sullivan touched the small carved horse in his shirt pocket, Nalnish's gift that had become a talisman of promises kept and faith rewarded. Then he urged his mare forward into the growing light, following people who had taught him that the courage to choose your own path was the only freedom that could never be taken away. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces as they rode toward a horizon that held both loss and possibility in equal measure. And in the growing heat of the day, the sound of hoofbeats and quiet voices carried across the desert like a prayer or a song or a story that would continue as long as there were people willing to remember what mattered most about being human in an uncertain world.